All right, shall we have at it? There's a couple things first. I committed a sin last week. How many of us have always learned when you do one of these floor speeches like I did a couple of weeks ago, and I never, ever, ever read the comments except over Thanksgiving. And so at first, I got to find a way to say thank you. You have a few hundred people who watch some idiot here try to sound like an economist and walk through what they see happening in the debt deficits and growth opportunity and the demographics. And remarkable, a lot of folks, really smart ideas and those things. Then you have about the half of them that are probably Russian trolls. They really do need to work on their English because they pop off saying, no English person would speak that way. The other thing that's also frustrating is you get the folks you can tell who are intellectually trapped about 2 decades out of date. My favorite one is, well, you can save Social Security by just raising the cap. I did entire floor speeches earlier in the year showing the economics and the numbers that take people over 400, 500,000, remove the cap. It was only covering 36, 38% of all shortfall. And now you have chewed up your sea corn. You have functionally no additional places to go to cover those other margins. So please, I appreciate everyone who's willing to comment. I appreciate the ideas, but here's an idea I'd like to share for anyone on this campus here and the members of Congress. If you go to our Schweikert website, our official website, there's a place there you can sign up for what we call the daily debt. And every day we send you a text message. And that text message, we reach over, we built this whole system to reach into the Treasury statements and tell you, hey, here's what we borrowed today. Here's what we borrowed this month. Here's what we borrowed per second. So like yesterday, we were, I think, at $74,500 a second over the last 12 months. Get that. Sign up for it. You're going to get a text message from us every working day. Those people who do not understand the gravity of the growth of the debt. We now have, I think, a few thousand people that get the daily debt text message from our office. And I think it's starting to change the culture around here to deal with reality. And I can give you an example. So just before we went on Thanksgiving, a couple of weeks ago, I held up this board saying, hey, we're going to hit $36 trillion of borrowing in the next day or so. I stand here with the same board from functionally two and a half weeks ago. It's no longer 36 trillion. As of yesterday, it's 36,170 billion. Meaning in those 2.5 weeks since we were last here, we've added another $170 billion of borrowing. At that current rate, we're clicking off functionally $1 trillion. What would that be? Every 105 days? So in all the people you heard come to the microphone this week, how many of them came from behind the microphone and say, we're going to borrow every 100-some days another $1 trillion? And there's the crisis. We have people walking up and down the hallways. I just had someone out here grabbing me, begging me, saying, no, don't cut any of our things that the Democrats gave us a couple of years ago. Yeah, I know every dime of it is borrowed money. Remember, and I need to, let's see if I can make this make sense. For every dollar of tax receipts we take in last year, we borrow $1, we spend $1.39. So we take in $1, we spend $1.39. So that $1.39 is borrowed. And these numbers just get worse. And this is the thing that makes people so angry. Every dollar of the borrowing over the next decade is not some fancy this or that. It's interest and healthcare costs. I think we're in a moment where baby boomer retirements this year will be about 13,000 people a day. They're moving into their earned benefits. Remember, we have a societal deal. You work so many quarters, you get Social Security. You do this, you pay in your FICA taxes, those things, you get Medicare. Okay, but this place is unwilling to have conversations about how to modernize the way we deliver healthcare to change the price. So every day, this government's going to borrow $6 or $7 billion. It's the math. So think of that. And even, I added on here, even if I remove the interest we have to pay every day, for every dollar we take in, we spend $1.21. Interest this year will be about $1 trillion. A decade from now, that almost doubles. It's our reality. So let's actually try to make a point here once again. And I'm sorry for anyone who's been crazy enough to watch one of these presentations, but for some reason I can't get this to sink in. Take a look. This is the 2024, so we've already gone through this. Mandatory, 24%. What we get to vote on, about 26% of spending. What that means is, you see here in the blue, non-defense and defense, every dime a member of Congress here votes on is borrowed. Every dime in defense is borrowed. Every dime in discretionary is borrowed. And the borrowing, remember the previous slide I showed you, for every dollar we take in, we spend $1.39. You know what that means? A chunk of what is mandatory. Now, what is mandatory, David? It's those earned benefits. It's borrowed money. And I need to explain this real quick, because back to the comments on last week's speech, Social Security does not add to the debt. Paying back the borrowed money from the Social Security Trust Fund does add to the debt. So let's walk through this once again. Here's Social Security. They built up a trust fund of trillions of dollars. But today, the tax receipts that come in from your payroll tax, that 12.4% for Social Security, half paid by typically your employer or you, unless you're self-employed, you pay for the whole thing. Those taxes don't cover the benefits. So this month, all those taxes come in, Treasury, Social Security calculates, saying, oh, we're short this much. Reach over, call Treasury and say, we have these special Treasury bills that we pay interest on. They actually get a fairly decent rate of interest on them. We need to cash in this Treasury. So Treasury goes and borrows money to give money back, to pay back the money they've borrowed from Social Security. No one stole your money. Social Security doesn't add to the debt. Paying back the trust fund of Social Security does, because the money is borrowed. I hope I said that in the simplest fashion. But the point I'm trying to make here, we're on the cusp of being able maybe to try to do very hard things. But the army of bureaucrats, the army of people that want stuff, and there's spending, here's a check, but there's also spending through the tax code. Look, I'm on Ways and Means, where give us this special carve out. Well, that's technically spending. But everyone needs to get your head around. Every dime we as members of Congress vote on is borrowed money. All right, so let's actually have a little something even more dystopian. Yay! Depends on how you like to calculate it. Most people are going to tell you that last fiscal year, which ended, October 1st. So the 2024 fiscal year, United States federal government borrowed 6.4% of the economy. If you put in the interest paid back to the trust funds, it may be like 6.8. But think of that. So the entire economy, you're borrowing that 6.4% of the entire economy that year. Why this chart is important, the baseline of law, and this is where I'm going to make some people angry in a moment, so hang on, The baseline says in 9 budget years, we're not borrowing that 6, 6.5, 6.8, whatever it actually is. We're going to be borrowing 9.2% of the entire U.S. economy that year's debt. And the next year's bigger, and the next year's bigger, and the next year's even bigger. And it's demographics. It's debt deficits and demographics. Debt is driven by us. We got older as a population. A couple of weeks ago, I showed some of the, if you go to this Census Bureau data set, you can see if you do some of the math, it's somewhere between 11 and 16 years the United States has more deaths than births. Process that. What are you willing to do policy-wise to deal with the reality that all across America over the next decade, you're going to see schools closing because there's fewer kids? It's already here. And look, I'm 62, my wife's 62. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 9-year-old because we're pathologically optimistic. But when you look at this chart, I always think that joke is funny, but maybe it's a little too dark. This chart makes it clear. Baseline, in 9 years, we're borrowing 9.2% of the economy. So what happens when, if you read the political Washington press this week, we all know we have a huge tax issue we have to deal with. Parts of the 2017 tax reform that I was part of from Ways and Means expire, meaning working people, LLCs, small businesses, partnerships, those things all have your taxes go back to the tax rates prior to 2017. Okay. First year in 2026, it's about $400 billion. Over the 10 years, as we often talk about things here, it's what? Let's use $4.6 trillion. Okay. We have a number of members, more in the Senate, saying, don't pay for it. Creating sort of this language saying, well, we're going to say it's policy baseline. No, the law is the taxes are going up, we should find a way to pay for it. But if we do policy baseline, this is at the end of the decade, we're not borrowing 9.2% of the economy, add about another point on that. So you're somewhere in the 10% of the entire economy will be borrowed every year. I need you to think through, for people that are interested who watch world markets and debt and what's going on in the world. How many of you remember this last summer? What happened in Great Britain? Remember? We're going to lower taxes. I love lower taxes. What happened to the British pound? What happened to British interest rates? Remember the bond vigilantes showed up? What happened in France just 2 days ago? Remember they were trying to do an austerity budget, just trying to get back to where they're mandated under the European Union on their amount of debt they're borrowing, and the government collapsed. What happened in South Korea? Remember, part of that battle was trying to do a budget because South Korea's population is collapsing. Maybe we should actually have some introspection here of what's going on with us and the world. And do you think the people that we sell our debt to are going to keep looking the other way and just keep buying it? Are they going to want premiums? Or are we going to have taken so much capital out of the economy that there's almost no growth? Because you actually have both models out there. You have where debt markets have charged very high interest rates because of the debt. You also have the Japanese model. Now, they had huge savings, but they also went, 2 decades with almost no economic growth because the capital didn't go to new plant and equipment to become more productive. It went to finance the country's debt. Both are miserable because both create the same amount of tax receipts. You have very high interest rates. I got to finance that. So here's my spendable dollars. Very low growth, lower tax receipts. Both cause the same crisis. So if you're someone that likes to have the intellectual, okay, go do some academic papers, it's great, but the effect to our society is the same. This is the baseline. This is without the games and the gimmicks. So, Let's one more time do one of the most difficult boards here. Well, actually, no, I'm going to skip one. Let's finish this thought. So both CBO and then one of my joint economic PhDs basically we're working on even modernizing or updating the data that CBO put out a couple days ago on, hey, what would happen if that portion of the expiring tax provisions, we continue it. So we continue the taxes for working people and small business and those things, but we find a way to pay for it. Turns out, and this chart's a little hard to read because we printed this at last second, but if you can get up here, what happens is if you pay for it, you actually get positive growth. You get to do the extension of the current tax policy, but if you pay for it, the size of the economy actually grows. Tax receipts actually go up. If you just throw it on the debt bucket, you actually slow down the economy. You have stripped so much more capital. Remember, I just told you, what, 4.6 trillion over the 10 years. You've just sucked that much out of available capital for you to be able to get a loan to buy that plant equipment, to become a more productive business, to invest in your workers so that you can pay them more. This is the battle that you're going to see around here for the next few months of, do we look the other way, say, oh, let's just do it's easy, stick it on our kids, stick it on your retirement. Yeah, we'll pay all sorts of interest. Yes, the bond markets will punish us. Maybe at some point we'll have the fun of a failed bond auction because the bond market will realize we have no sense here of how fragile we're making the U.S. economy by the piling on of U.S. debt. But the economists said, Congress, Senate, if you're listening, try to do the moral work of let's extend those tax cuts. They're based in, these are for hardworking people, small businesses. Extend them. Do the hard work and find a way to pay for it. And that's how you get the morality of the benefit of additional economic growth and also communicate to those debt markets that the United States is actually serious about starting to provide some stability. Remember, and it's actually been 6-7 weeks since I last actually did this chart, but at that time, the United States was number 14 on the credit stack, meaning Greece could sell a 10-year bond cheaper than the United States. You want us to still have the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar being the dollar that denominates the world for trade, those things. Do you think we get to continue to hold that extraordinary privilege when we're crushing the debt markets with more debt, flooding the world with more of our bonds? This isn't a game. And I know it's hard to go home and talk to your voters and say, hey, we borrow as of yesterday, $74,500 a second. Our expectation is by the end of the year, that number may be somewhere in the mid-80s, maybe approaching $90,000 a second. And what's the driver? So this is the CBO number, and the chart's actually a little out of date. 100% of the debt for the next 30 years is the very thing the idiots like members of Congress like me aren't allowed to come behind these microphones and tell you. Interest. That's the interest is the, well, let's see, interest is the blue, but it's Medicare. And in 9 years from now, when the Social Security trust fund's empty, do you double senior poverty in America? Or do you find some way to backfill that? Do you reach into the general fund and say we're going to supplement it? Or do we actually have any people here? Except the problem is you're not allowed to actually talk about Social Security because the Democrats over there are going to run attack ads on you, making it absolutely toxic to have the morality of how do you fix Social Security. Because it's math. The trust fund will go empty. So, $124 trillion deficit. But guess what has $9 trillion of, we'll call it positive, because it grew, the spending grew slower than the economy. It's actually what we call defense, non-defense discretionary. So so ultimately it becomes what? $115 trillion of debt 30 years from now. It's 100% interest Medicare, interest Social Security. It's our demographics. And if someone around here goes, well, they stole my money. No, they didn't steal your money. The average couple on Social Security, it's a crap rate of return, but you get all the money you put into Social Security in like $72,000 spiff. It's Medicare that average couple puts in, oh, forgive me, I don't have my chart, but it was like $280,000 over their work life, and they get like $700,000 back. It's that's the primary driver of U.S. debt. And my argument is, don't talk about going and cutting benefits, talk about modernizing it. Do you not think the technology around us, the ability to make people healthier, when we've actually done whole presentations that obesity over the next 10 years is over $9 trillion additional healthcare spending, wouldn't the morality of making people healthier, helping them be healthier, be incredibly moral and really good for federal debt? And that's part of the argument. I come here over and over and over, and I'm going to show some charts on that. Modernize, modernize, modernize. So the binary the binary folks around here that say, tax more, cut more. I have a whole presentation I've done here multiple times. All the taxes that the Democrats want to do, we've scored them. It's about 1.5% of GDP when you do the economic effects. Almost every cut proposal that's been done on our side is about 1% of GDP. So you got 2.5%. I just showed you in 9 years we're over 9.2% of the economy. 2.5. Last year we borrowed what? 6.4, 6.8, depends on what you want to score. Does anyone see a problem? All the discussions that come behind these microphones is we're going to tax more. It's just a fraction of the problem. We're going to cut our way. It's a fraction of the problem. Until you modernize, have that modern revolution in how we deliver services, what we think of as government, how we do it, you can't change the spending enough. Problem is that requires thinking, reading, and also requires our staff, and for any staff that are watching this, read things that you normally wouldn't. One of the things I'm incredibly hopeful when you have someone like Elon Musk and the conversations we had yesterday, and you could tell saying, how do I deliver the service and use technology to do it better, faster, cheaper, and dramatically more morality of not destroying the United States economy. Because if this economy, when we hiccup, the rest of the world gets a cold, God forbid, if we had a debt crisis, how much of the world goes into mass starvation and poverty? And we don't think about the morality of our place in the world. So let's actually do some things that are a little more difficult math-wise. The U.S. will spend $1.39 for every dollar of revenue. Fine. Trying to point out, in the budget year we're walking into now, do you see the little black line? Okay, that's the break even. So that's where our tax receipts. Do you notice a problem? Now, every dime of the gray, which is what I get to vote on, is borrowed money. But now it's actually going into things that are mandatory. The blue is interest, which you got to pay. So think of this, all here is mandatory. Last year and this coming year, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger into the future. Every dime of tax receipts is not enough to even cover the things that are on autopilot. And yet, I will get some of the folks around here that will go, well, you guys did tax reform in 2017. Do you remember what was happening? Do you remember how many U.S. businesses were abandoned in the United States? Do you remember what growth rates were, what productivity investments were? So at some point here, I know we're going to have to deal with the falsehoods, particularly the left and the press walk through. It was tax cuts for rich people, except it's more progressive than the old tax system, meaning the wealthy now pay a higher percentage of U.S. income tax spending than they did before. So we threw this chart together just to try to point out, there's where we did tax reform. Do you notice the entire world, industrialized world, what is the country that actually had the investment in productivity and growth? Us. Right today, we actually have a pretty darn good economy. GDP now, I think yesterday was projecting we're sitting at about 3.2% GDP. That didn't just magically happen. We can also see some of the giveaway money that the Democrats did in the Inflation Reduction has had almost no true economic productivity impact. It turns out it was the allocations of the tax reform at the end of 2017. And the problem is those provisions that got us that productivity are expiring. Some of them have already substantially expired. How do you deal with the concept of we have no money, but we need to fix things in the tax code because we need the growth, but we need wage growth because we just finished an inflation cycle. In my community, the Phoenix, Scottsdale area, unless you make about 27% more today than you did the day Joe Biden took office, you are poor. Think of that. So you want to know why so many Americans are cranky? They're poor. So it's not enough to take credit for the economy being good. Great, but if your wages haven't kept up with inflation, you're poor. And this is just a point, because there was a Democrat member earlier today buying one of these microphones, giveaways to rich people. All righty. Look, I would love to be one of the top 1%. Yay. But they represent about 22% of all income, which is stunning. I believe we need dramatically more wealth income growth in, let's call it the lower quartiles. Great. You get that through productivity investment. But that 22% of income pays 40% of all U.S. income taxes. One more time, today's tax code is more progressive than before the Republicans' tax reform. How many times have you heard a Democrat come behind these microphones and tell the truth about that math? And if you actually take, I think this was, there was something on here saying if you actually did like the top 50% of income pay like 85 or something. Let's see if I can find it on here as I'm just standing here staring. I think it's on one of my next charts. But we have a remarkably progressive tax system. But that's on income taxes. And often when you hear people talk about taxes, they conflate things. Here's your payroll tax, but you're getting back, that's actually to fund those retirement benefits. How do you think you get your Social Security? How do you think you get your Medicaid? How do you think you get your unemployment? But the portion of income tax is actually remarkably progressive. The top 1% share of income taxes has increased over time. So this is sort of, let's see if I can make this work. So last year, in let's call it 21, 45% of all income taxes were paid by that top 1%. Now look, we may have the reality of having to deal with all these tax brackets. But it's so hard to make public policy when you have people polluting the minds of the American public with things that are fake. Look, I think there was a senator from New York that used to say, you're welcome to your own opinion, but you're not welcome to your own facts. The facts are the facts are the facts. And if you're going to do hard things and hard math, can we at least agree? And I get this one came from Tax Foundation. You know, that's a nonpartisan group. So, look, so let's actually walk through ideas. Okay, so we're going to have to fix the expirations on the tax code. We have an incoming president that has ambitions of how do we help, particularly the working middle class. You have people like me who are terrified of the speed and the growth of debt for my own retirement, let alone my kids. Remember, my 2.5-year-old, the math says he will now be part of the first generation that will be poorer than his parents. The math says today, when he is 23 years old, 24 years old, U.S. taxes will have to, all U.S. taxes, from tariffs down to income taxes, everything will have to have doubled just to maintain baseline spending. It's demographics. We got old as a society, we're getting older as a society, and starting in 1990, the number of children we had started falling. It's math. So if I came to you right now and said, all right, let's think like economists. Let's do the morality that we believe growth is moral. It's also the American birthright. So one of the tax issues we need to work on is the two things that had some of the greatest impact in growing the U.S. economy was one, expensing. You're the company, you're going to buy a new piece of equipment so you can make things better, faster, cheaper. And how do you pay people more money? Inflation, well, that doesn't get you anything. So productivity. You pay your workers more because they're more productive, and investments in plant and equipment mean you're more productive. We showed in all sorts of charts that ability to buy that piece of equipment and expense it. And that's not a tax cut, it's a timing effect. You could depreciate it over 7 years or take it right now. If you do the long run, the Treasury still gets the same money. They actually get more by expensing because your investment cycle in becoming more productive is faster. Great. Well, there's a second half of that, and that was expensing for research and development. You're going to spend money trying to come up with the new pharmaceutical or the new piece of technology or a new, better, faster way to do something. It's expensive because often they fail. But that's how you stay ahead of the world and you keep the United States as an innovation leader. Well, we're doing some math right now saying what happens if you were to come back, reinstate that expensing for research and development, but now we're being told we don't really have enough people with the advanced STEM degrees to actually do some of that hard science. So what would happen if you said, we're going to do this as tax policy, but we need the other policy of, we need to go to a talent-based immigration system. As President Trump said, we're insane. We educate people, and then we send them home. It's the point. And so we did some math over this summer, and we're going to actually do a whole presentation on it. And this makes people mad, but it's math. And it's good math, and it's well documented. When you have inbound populations into the United States, I'm not going to categorize whether they came in as asylum seekers, or they crossed the border illegally, or they were on some sort of visa, whatever it is. But those with less than high school, they actually, our model, and the literature says they cost maybe $360,000 to society because of the benefits we give. But over here, the green, this is what happens if you bring people in who have advanced degrees. Turns out society takes in well over $800,000 in tax receipts, over their time. So if I came to you and said, we need the vibrance of economic growth, we need to be innovators, we need this, and we need their money because I got to have a way to keep paying for the benefits we've promised. What happens as we start to do our tax reform? We also said, hey, we're going to do things that fix that depreciation of research and development so we can be an innovative leader, but we're also going to do a talent-based immigration and attach that to it so we actually have the talent so we maximize the growth. You go, oh, it's just sort of a unified theory. They work together. That's what I'm trying to pitch here. Please think. This place often is, I use the term binary. It's do this or do that. It's more complex. Sometimes it's 4 or 5 pieces of legislation that have to interact with each other. Then some regulations, then some other policies that all come together to maximize the benefit of the idea. To our brothers and sisters in the staff, start thinking like economists. The hole we have dug for this nation is remarkably massive. If you think there's simple solutions to the complexity of the debt problem we have, you're absolutely wrong. Turns out the solution is going to be complex. It is doable. Time is just running out. So let's do some ideas. Hey, Schweikert, you get behind the microphone. So I'm just going to race through some of these ideas. Some of them I've done before. But there's one I want to do backwards. So let's see, I skipped it last week. So let's see. Okay, the last 6 years, we've had 390,000 Americans die of fentanyl. 390,000 of our brothers and sisters died. Some were accidental. Some were addicts. I don't think society was ever prepared for a synthetic drug that almost instantly rewires the brain. So do this thought experiment with me. If I came to you and said, hey, there's going to be, we're going to call it a vaccine. It's technically not a vaccine. A vaccine for fentanyl that actually does a protein attachment, meaning so it can't break the brain-blood barrier. It lasts for 6 months to a year. Just that, we think we gain over $11 billion. And we haven't even worked in the cost estimates of what happens when you have 390,000 of your brothers and sisters dead over 6 years. Start to think like a revolutionary. Instead of dumping more money into rehab, why don't we do the rehab and say, hey, there's a chance here we can make it so the fentanyl addiction, or you're the law enforcement or the firefighter, you don't die from the exposure to it. And guess what? The idea is great economics. This is an example of thinking differently. What happens instead of spending the money maintaining people's misery? You could spend money to end the misery. We've done a number of different bills, from diabetes to other things, saying we need to help our brothers and sisters have affordable insulin. Wouldn't it be more moral if we could actually take on that 33% of U.S. healthcare spending, it's just diabetes, and dramatically reduce the number of our brothers and sisters that have the disease? That's moral. The other is just maintenance of misery. So let's just run through a couple other ones that we've been trying to model. The Medicare Transparency Fraud Prevention Act. Turns out there's a couple great articles out there, and if you dive into them, what's the most powerful thing you can do to deal with Medicare fraud? It's not a bunch of lawyers. It's not a bunch of investigators. It's a data scientist. Problem is, data scientists are really expensive right now, and CMS is having trouble working out their pay schedule to hire them. But the person that sits down and builds the model and says, okay, this doesn't make sense, go look at that. This doesn't make sense. We believe there's $60 billion annually. Not over 10 years, every single year. In Medicare fraud. And you can find it using data scientists. Well, remember how I was telling you before, we need to find, a few, $4 trillion or so to cover extension of the tax cuts? That's $400 billion a year. I just found just $60 billion doing the right thing. There are ideas here. The use of technology that, hey, Here's my doctor's notes. Here's my insurance contract. Do you have a bunch of billers fight with each other over months and months and months and months, trying to collect between the insurance company and the insurance company saying you didn't document things right? Well, there's this concept of clean claims where the AI says, here's the doctor's notes. It matches the contract, automatically pay it. We think that saves $31 billion every year. Well, heaven, I'm getting close to $100 billion just in those two things using technology. We've already dropped a piece of legislation, now this one's over 10 years, that just cleans up some of the fraud and sets some timelines on the employer retention tax credit. Well, that's almost $80 billion. These are just a handful of ideas that we've actually had scored. How do I get the brothers and sisters around here, the members who are elected, their staff, the press, the public? There are solutions where you don't have to keep piling on to debt, but it's a revolution using technology to make government better, faster, cheaper. There's hope. There really is hope. Why the hell is this place so terrified of doing anything different? So many of the solutions you hear around here sound like it's the 1990s. We're all walking around with a supercomputer in the palm of our hands. Use that technology to make this another American century. Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, I am losing my voice, and I think I actually made the point. Thank you for tolerating my diatribe, and I also know you have an appointment you really need to get to. So with that, I yield back.